Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson. Founded in 1961 by strategist Herman Kahn, Hudson Institute challenges conventional thinking and helps manage strategic transitions to the future. On behalf of Hudson's South and Central Asia program, I welcome you to today's talk on India and China after the Doklam standoff. This summer, the two countries were involved in an almost 8-week-long standoff over their 2,000 miles long border. The crisis erupted when India opposed China's attempts to extend a border road through the Doklam plateau. The standoff ended in end August 2017. China is one of India's top trading partners, with almost 70 billion in bilateral trade. Yet the two countries view each other as adversaries, and incursions and military standoffs repeatedly happened in the last few years. We are privileged that to discuss this, we have with us today Dr. Manoj Joshi, Distinguished Fellow, Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. Most of you know Dr. Joshi and you have his bio in front of you. So I will only say that he has spent 3 decades as a journalist. He was most recently a member of the Task Force on National Security. He has also written 2 books on Kashmir. Personally, I'm thrilled that Dr. Joshi and I actually share not only the part of the country we come from in India, but that his 2 alma mater, St. Stephen's College and Jawaharlal University, are mine as well. What I was hoping to do was to ask Dr. Joshi to speak for about 15-20 minutes, and then I would use my privilege to ask him a few questions before I open up the floor to the audience. Dr. Joshi.
Thank you, Aparna, and great pleasure to be here at Hudson, and especially when my fellow countrywoman is introducing me. We come from a very small neck of woods back in India, and so I feel especially proud that Aparna is introducing me. I'm going to put up 2 maps and later on just to explain. So when I start speaking, don't get, I think it can get a bit bewildering when I give certain details. So this Doklam standoff that began in June 16th was when China tried to build a road in the Doklam area. I think if we can have the second one first, it would be a great idea, because the second one, this is the Doklam area. The other one. Yeah. So in this area, this part of it is China. This is India, and this is Bhutan, but China contests this. China says that it belongs to it. They have in any case built a road here in 2005. This is a New York Times map. So they had built a road here in 2005, and then they would patrol to this area on foot. This is just about 2 or 3 kilometers. The crucial thing is this area. This is a ridge which overlooks a very sensitive part of India. So this is called the Doklam Plateau. India has strong positions here. That's our road. This is the Chinese road. This is Bhutan here, and all this is Bhutan. And this, as I said, is the area which China contests. That's just by way of illustration. So now, when they tried to extend that road, 2 companies of Indian soldiers driving bulldozers came down on that area and blocked that road construction activity. And that is what the crisis was all about. And on June 30th, the Indians issued a statement saying that the stand was motivated by the need to assist Bhutan, but also its security. So we were very upfront on the fact that we felt that our security was affected by that move to build that road. And as I explained to you, that ridge, very sensitive ridge, it looks down on the area, very sensitive area of India, which I will show you. Now, for a long time, the tri-junction between Sikkim, Bhutan, and India was a matter of contention, but it was fairly peaceful. There were some minor transgressions, 2007, 2012, there were some crises. Nothing else came out. My own view is that the Chinese action was actually linked to Bhutan. And the idea was Bhutan and India-Bhutan relations. In the past decade, China has concluded that its border negotiations with Bhutan are not going anywhere. China and Bhutan dispute the entire border is disputed. They've been trying to negotiate it since the 1990s, but they don't seem to be going anywhere. The issue is not so much Bhutan, but I think the growing belief that with its growing economic dominance, the time has come for China to establish its regional primacy. When I say regional primacy, so it means whether you say Asia-Pacific area, whether you say Central Asia, and then of course South Asia, because China is a major neighbor of South Asia. And so they're trying to, because if you want to become a world power, as Xi Jinping recently said that China wanted to become, you've first got to be a regional power. And then, so there is a certain logic out there. But in South Asia, the big problem is Bhutan, because Bhutan has a special relationship with India. It has ties with China, but there is no Chinese embassy in Bhutan. So this is a bit irksome to China. They have a lot of Chinese tourists are now going to Bhutan. Chinese calculations in Bhutan are both by way of, as I said, of being a major player in South Asia, as well as the fact that Bhutan is also has a Tibetan culture, and it has some impact on the Tibetan, on Tibet itself and the future of Tibet. So that's the. Now the Chinese, of course, dismiss. They say that the Bhutanese don't own that area, that Doklam area. They say that area belongs to China. India is the villain of the piece. I was in Beijing in August, and there was a very smart Chinese Foreign Ministry official, Wong Wenlin, and she said that the Bhutanese have said that they don't, they had not invited the Indians, and that the area where the Indians had intervened was not Bhutanese territory. So the Chinese say that, the Bhutanese, and the Bhutanese have been very, very circumspect, if I may say so, but the Bhutanese did formally protest on June 29th. There was a formal protest launched. Now, of course, if there had been, if this crisis had erupted into war, it would not have been so much over the Doklam issue. The border would have been an occasion for the conflict that has been building up for a while, not the cause. Such a war would, of course, be extremely strange, because as I told you, that this invasion, the so-called invasion out here, is from this ridge here, down here, is 100 meters. And this is what I told my Chinese interlocutors. I said, you are, and several PLA officers who I met in Beijing, and they said, you Indians must withdraw. If you don't withdraw, we will compel you to withdraw. And it's a very tough language indeed in August at that time. So I told them, I said, look, it would be really strange if you go to war over an invasion of 100 meters. By your own statement, it's not our statement. You said that Indians had come in 100 to 180 meters. So, but then subsequently, of course, as you know, that the crisis has died down, and as of now, there is status quo ante, meaning the Chinese have stopped their road construction. We are back up the 100 meters up that ridge, and I think the India and China, as you know, have many unresolved issues between them, and I think one of the first and foremost is their entire border, which China sometimes very deviously says is 2,000 kilometers, whereas the Indians say it is 4,057 kilometers. So, but the Chinese never give an explanation as to why they say it's 2,000 kilometers. But our surmise is that it is because they ignore the western border completely. They say that Jammu and Kashmir is disputed. That's not an immediate issue between us. But whatever it is, the Chinese keep shifting goalposts all the time. That's one feature of their behavior out there. But I think the greater reason for a possible outbreak of Sino-Indian conflict or war, if indeed that occurs, will be their differing perceptions of themselves and their place in the world. In the 1950s, as you're aware, India was pitched as the great democratic hope of the free world against communist China. Today, the rise of both countries, with India maybe a decade and a half behind China, has given this conflict a new kind of a twist. China is seeking, as I said, China is seeking regional preeminence, increasingly challenges India in the South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. This is not something that happened suddenly. It has come with the steady growth of Chinese economic muscle around the world and in this region. The Chinese find that their economic clout far exceeds their military clout. They have and they believe that at some point this has to catch up. But to reach that state of being a true global power, they must have a neighborhood which is benign. In other words, they must establish regional primacy, as I told you, as a precondition. Now, so far in South Asia, they have followed a very convenient model of offsetting India's advantages by backing Pakistan to the hilt. Given their enhanced clout in South Asia and the fact that their economy is 5 times that of India and its military considerably stronger, they are seeking a situation where India either accepts Chinese primacy or is subdued through Chinese politico-military policy in the South Asian and Indian Ocean region. This seems to be their kind of long-term pattern. However, of course, India has its own sense of self-worth in the global scheme of things, and accepting Chinese primacy in its neighborhood is not part of this. And so it's seeking to offset Chinese power through growing proximity to the United States and Japan, who have their own reasons to keep China in check. Now, ever since Mr. Modi came to power, India has taken significant steps to come closer to both these two countries, China and Japan. Of course, to some extent, this is a bit of a dangerous game because it actually feeds into Beijing's belief that these 3 countries are conspiring to stifle the Chinese dream. It is something which must be looked at with a little bit of caution. Of course, in India's case, yes, India has maybe sometimes a inflated view of its own place in the world, but India cannot escape the fact that its military modernization remains stuck and its economy is yet to get into the promised high growth path. You need these 2 things if you have to deter China. The Modi government has the political support to make the kind of reforms that could change things, or if things don't work out, that actually pushes us towards the United States, towards the formal alliance maybe with the United States. And as a leading scholar of China and Sino-Indian relations, John Garver, pointed out recently, that it might actually make sense for China to teach India a lesson before China's advantage is eroded. That's what Garver said, meaning this could be a factor in the conflict. Now, of course, what the Doklam crisis has done is that it has torpedoed the work of special representatives who were trying to resolve the Sino-Indian border issue. We don't have the full picture, but there was a consensus on the special representatives had an 18-point consensus through which, if they had been given the political direction, they could have resolved the border issue. What has also happened is that the Doklam crisis shows that all the confidence-building measures that had been put in place since 1993 somehow don't seem to be working. Every decade we have a new confidence-building measure. It's like, a little bit in the South China Sea, you have the Declaration of Code of Conduct, and then you have the Code of Conduct, and then you have something else, and it keeps on, but it somehow doesn't resolve the issue. Now, of course, I'm told that after a gap of a year, the special representatives will meet, maybe next month or the month after that. The person who is heading the Chinese side is Yang Jiechi, who has just been elevated to the Politburo and might become the vice premier of China. That means become even more powerful. But the Chinese, despite the fact that it's a very remote area for China, this is an area where the Chinese are focused. And this was best brought out recently. On October 21st, China had its, the Chinese 19th Party Congress ended. On October 29th, the Chinese press had this fascinating item which said that Xi Jinping had replied to a letter written to him by a family of a man, a herder, and his 2 daughters. And these herders had written to him, congratulating him for the Congress, etc. So Xi Jinping wrote back to them, and this letter was released on October 29th, that I would like to thank you for safeguarding the sovereignty of China, because you're living in this remote area, you're doing a great job, etc., etc. So to me, it appeared like a signal that it's a signal that the Tibet border is something which is very much in the minds of the Chinese leadership. And the reason why it happens, I can understand that because, as Aparna said, we both come from the mountain area. In the northern part of the mountain area, it's a very difficult and terrible area. You have a bit of a depopulation going on. Because the Chinese economy is doing well, Chinese are becoming richer, so Indians are also doing slightly well. So why the hell should you live in that godforsaken area? So you quietly drift out, you migrate, and so soon there's no one living there except the armies. And so I think there is a pressure on both sides to try and get people to work there. I just want to put the future context before you. Since the 1990s, India's relations with China have worked along 4 C's: conflict, cooperation, competition, and containment. At any given moment, there's a salience of one or the other. So we know what conflict is all about. We've had the 62 war. We've just seen the Doklam standoff. Cooperation is manifested in both India's membership of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, of the BRICS, the so-called BRICS Bank, New Development Bank, India's membership of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Here we are actually, and many multilateral fora, we are cooperating with China. So the one is conflict, then is cooperation. Competition is for regional influence in the South Asia, Indian Ocean region. Chinese economic clout has already knocked out India from Central Asia. Now Chinese are stepping up their efforts in the South Asian and Indian Ocean region. There are not too many options for India, but closer collaboration with Japan is one of them, and that is happening. The most recent manifestation has been the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which was launched in March this year. The idea is to develop quality infrastructure in Africa along with maritime digital connectivity, and this linked to the notion of the free Indo-Pacific region. So the way they are looking at it is that we can provide an alternative, and as Secretary Tillerson spoke about predatory economic policies of China, so this grouping hopes to provide non-predatory, I hope, sort of economic assistance. In South Asia, at least, India is blessed by geography, in the sense that if you look at Nepal or Bangladesh or Bhutan, they have very few options other than India, meaning it has nothing to do with me, it has nothing to do with India, it has to do with geography. That so Indians have some leeway out there. Containment, this is the 4th C, is in the minds of both India and China. New Delhi believes that Beijing is seeking to contain it in South Asia, whereas China believes that we are becoming part of a US-led containment strategy in Asia. Now, as I said, Doklam didn't trigger a larger conflict, but the trend line is not heartening, and seems to suggest that we may just end up kicking the can down the road as far as Doklam is concerned. Powerful China may best India. This is what I told the Chinese in Beijing, that you may best us in a military conflict, but I can assure you, if we go down, we'll take you with us. Which means that the Indian dream will go, but so will the Chinese dream. Because 2 large countries of our size simply cannot afford to think in terms of maybe skirmishes and things like that, but surely not conflict. Now, from the Indian point of view, what we need to do stares us in the face. First, we need to carry out deep and systematic reform of the armed forces, which has been on the lines suggested by the group of ministers in 2002 and the Naresh Chandra Committee in 2012. This will provide the country with the wherewithal to deter a China which has successfully bitten the bullet on military reform. So we started military reform before China, but our reforms seem to be stuck. Second, India needs a genuine good neighbor policy. I think sometimes with Nepal or with Bhutan or with Bangladesh, we tend to over-securitize our relations, and I think we need to be a bit careful on that. Third, and of course, this is the most important, we've got to get our economic policy act together. India has wasted much of this decade, which was meant to be this takeoff decade. Even now, instead of focusing on reforming economic policy and governance structures, the Modi government tends to be caught up in the cycle of elections, meaning or electoral obsessed by winning the next election, and not doing the hard stuff that is needed for reforming the government system or the governance system. There is a tendency on the part of the Modi government to look for silver bullets, like demonetization, that we will one sweep, we will transform India, or the goods and services tax and things like that. So I think we really need to sober up, if I may put it that way, if we need to confront this challenge, which is a very substantial challenge on the part of China, which has a very skillful leadership, which has a very determined leadership, which already has a huge lead over us. So I'll conclude here, and then we can.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. Actually, I'd like to draw you out on a few things you said. First is you were in China in August, and you have followed the 19th Party Congress and written extensively on it. What are some of the key takeaways with respect to how China will behave? You mentioned regional primacy, but if I could ask you to sort of elaborate a little more. I mean, how does China see South Asia playing into it, or South China Sea, or United States? How does it see these countries playing into what it desires in the next 5 to 10 years under President Xi?
Well, one is what we have seen in the case of Pakistan. It has become an important part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese have offered huge investments in Pakistan, investment in the energy sector, investment in the connectivity sector. If you look at Bangladesh, last year when President Xi Jinping was in Bangladesh, he offered $24 billion worth of investments, which was several times more than what India had an offer. Likewise, in Nepal, the Chinese investment is steadily rising, and so the Chinese have a huge amount of money on offer, which to construct infrastructure in these various countries. Whereas in the case of India, what the Chinese have been successful in is that they have already transformed their own country, infrastructure-wise. Now, India's problem is that if you start offering money to others for infrastructure, the Indians are going to say, hey, what about me? Meaning, what about back home? First, you got to do this, and then you're welcome to do that. But as I said, India is trying to partner with Japan. Japan's an important partner for us in many of these areas. And perhaps we can come up with a coherent model. Here, I must say that President Trump was in Asia, and he also spoke of various things. I mean, the newspapers today have him say grand things about that visit. The problem is that America doesn't have money, meaning America has no money to put up. So it's one thing for Mr. Tillerson to say that we oppose predatory financing and things like that. It's quite another thing to say, hey, when the African and Asian countries say, but at least the Chinese have built a railroad for me, or a road for me. What do you have in offer? So rhetoric is not enough. There is no substitute. So there must be some kind of a more coherent economic policy answer, in the sense that Trump's visit to Asia had a lot on the security part of it. So he spoke about North Korea, he spoke about appeared to be more muscular in the South China Sea issue, etc. But as far as the economic policy is concerned, it was America first, in the sense he had great deals, $250 billion worth of deals with the Chinese. But that doesn't really solve the problem of the coalition and allies and others who are confronting increasing Chinese assertiveness. And this assertiveness comes in pretty tough ways, in the sense the South Koreans set up the THAAD missile system, and the Chinese reacted by cutting off the flow of tourists, and also this Lotte company, which has been driven to the ground in China. So the message is very clear. The message is very clear, that if you guys don't behave, we have ways of dealing with you.
So I'll follow up with that and ask you. Secretary Tillerson spoke of a 100-year relationship with India. We're coming up just a few days after the discussion about the Quad. And you wrote a recent piece in which you were a little skeptical about the Quad. And I'll quote you, "Mooted as an alliance of democracies, it seeks to upend everything we know about international relations, where the drivers are national interests rather than values." With so many people actually in this city, in Delhi, Tokyo, Canberra, thrilled about the Quad, why are you so skeptical?
Well, as I said, that when countries have national interests, okay, and in national interest, this business of shared values, etc., is a bit over the top. And if you remember, I gave you the example of World War II. I said World War II was an alliance of a partial democracy, which is the United States, of an imperial power, Britain, and a communist power, the Soviet Union, against the evil of Nazi Germany. So each one had interests. It was not shared values. So likewise, when we have seen foreign policy, sort of unfold, let us say in South Asia, we Indians have seen that the United States was an ally of Pakistan which was a military dictatorship. You see, so there was no shared values there. The shared values should have had US and India on one side. So I'm saying, I'm not complaining. All I'm trying to say is that the reality is that nations pursue their interests. Nations pursue their interests, and out here I'm not able to see, because Japan faces an existential threat from North Korea. India doesn't face that threat. Japan has to be focused completely on North Korea. Likewise, Australia, I'm not sure. It's separated by a huge ocean from everyone else. And Australia might want to be part of the American drive in the Pacific Ocean. But we have a disputed border with China. If pressure builds up on the border, no one's going to come to assist us. And no one can assist us. And I don't think India should expect that. But we don't have an identity of views on these things. Japan doesn't recognize the Jammu and Kashmir as being part of India. Neither does the United States. So if you have so many differences on basic issues, what kind of a Quad? What does it mean? And my principal argument always has been that India's foremost external interests are the Persian Gulf, Northern Arabian Sea region. Why? Because 70% of our oil comes from there. If that oil is disrupted for even a week, there's crisis in Delhi. There's chaos in Delhi, I shouldn't say crisis. So 70% of our oil comes from the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. 7 million of our citizens work there, remitting $35 billion annually to the country. No comparable area in the Southeast Asia or other parts exists. And the strange thing is that the US wants us to collaborate, cooperate, etc. in that region, but we have no conversation in the other region. There's zero conversation on what is happening there, primarily because the division has been on the basis of military divisions. So the Pacific, we deal with the Pacific Command when it comes to Asia Pacific, and the CENTCOM, we have no dealings. So I think this is not a particularly effective way of creating that 100-year friendship, because you need to be upfront on many of these issues. And I don't think we've reached that stage.
I have more questions, but I'll actually allow others to ask questions. Please wait for the microphone to come to you and identify yourself and your affiliation. Sagar, Polly, the lady.
You may have to tell, because sometimes.
Thank you. I'm Polly Nayak. I'm an independent consultant in Washington. And I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit, if you would, on what I understood to be your statement that China had already beaten out India in Central Asia. I just came back. Did I understand you correctly? That China was had pushed India out of its options in Central Asia? The reason I'm asking is I just spent a couple of weeks in Central Asia in the 5 independent republics. And my impression was that actually China has its nose in there, but not much more. That a lot of what I am seeing there is actually Russian, including some of the infrastructure building. So I just wanted to ask you to unfold that, if you would, please.
I'm just going by the figures we have of investments and aid. So if you look at that, India is not a player anymore. Meaning our investments may not exceed $1 billion in all those states. Chinese are 50 billion, investment and aid, and Chinese own a significant proportion of the national debts of many of those countries. And by the very fact of the pipelines, the 3-4 pipelines, oil and gas pipelines they have built, they have changed the economic face of that area, railroads. But when you point to Russia, it's interesting because the point is the Chinese have been very careful to defer to Russia. But if you recollect that, I think maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, the Russians in turn said that the Eurasian Economic Union and China will coordinate policy. So the problem is, Russia's problem is the shrinkage of Russia's kind of external ability to, the Russians are very good, they can go and drop bombs in Syria. But I'm not so sure that they have the capacity, to maintain their primacy, as it were, in Central Asia. Meaning, I think that is under siege, primarily because the Chinese have moved in a big way, and this is just the beginning. Meaning, what they are doing in the Kazakhstan-China, Xinjiang border, the kind of construction in those areas is quite fascinating. This is just the beginning.
No, I certainly take your point, and I'm not, I wouldn't argue any of the points you've made, except to say that culturally Russia's influence is so dominant. And I did see evidence of the tension between Russia and China over agreements that have to do with pipelines, et cetera. But I think there's quite a lot of tension, actually, and that deference hasn't taken any form that is sufficient in the eyes of the Russians. So I just had to bring that up. I do think you're right. Over time, the Chinese are buying Central Asia.
Well, no, I don't. My basic point is, Russia has shot itself in the foot, and when it's getting into it is in fairly straitened circumstances for reasons of its own creation, and so right now it's on a defensive mode. For example, by preventing the change of gauge of the railroads. Okay, so you're able to block off. That is the historic Russian strategy. We'll have our own railway gauge, and so the other guy can't come. But if you see what they have done in that Kyrgyz, it takes a train 40 minutes to transfer the containers from a Chinese train onto the Russian train, be off towards the Polish border. So there are some remarkable things happening there. It's true that, you see, when we talk of big powers, China, India, United States, etc., you have to also hand it to the smaller powers who use their tension for their own to their own advantage. I would say whether it is Nepal or whether it's Sri Lanka, in the case of India, whether it is some Central Asian republics, that's fair game. They're there. They say that if the Chinese are willing to come and put in money, who am I to complain?
Thanks for your presentation. I have two basic questions. One is from the cultural standpoint of view, is that China or India or Pakistan, do they have a real significant change from their traditional the kind of attitude or family value, ethic value? The second is about a current event about climate change. India and China, do they have a real cooperation or really fight each other from the standpoint of a renewable energy or non-renewable one? Do they have any competition?
India cooperate on climate change and energy and first is trying to have China, India, and Pakistan as region actually changed considering or what are the...
Okay. I think that the most sensible thing is for these large countries, because as I said, that when you're nuclear armed states, and when you talk so easily of conflict and war, it's a very dangerous kind of road that you're going down. So it is definitely these countries can cooperate. And if you look at various policy issues, if you look at, let's say, Pakistan and India, there have been points in time where we've been fairly close to having breakthroughs in our relationship. Likewise with China on the border issue, which is the real problem. We have been having talks, and we again are pretty close. But there are issues which are more intangible, in the sense when you talk of let's say when a country looks at its future, when it's looking at issues of primacy, hegemony, etc. These are much more difficult to pin down. What is the country's national goal? So if the country, as Xi Jinping says, that China will come to the center stage by 2050. So countries like India worry, meaning if China comes to the center stage, where do we get pushed at that point? So there are, as I said, the intangibles which are more difficult to lay your hands on. But certainly, I think that my own personal view, is that what Xi Jinping also often speaks of, the so-called win-win formulation, is something which needs to be actually win-win, meaning it needs to be actually laid out, and it's possible. It's not impossible. The point is the kind of thinking which realists say, or which defensive realists like Mearsheimer and others say, that there is really no alternative. Great powers will clash. Great powers will. There is a fight for primacy, and so I'm not sure. I'm kind of open in my mind to that. But I certainly think that, for example, in my own country, I have opposed our government's view on the One Belt, One Road. I think that India should take advantage of the Belt and Road Initiative and cherry pick it. Just like others are cherry picking it, they should cherry pick it instead of saying, no, we oppose it. So likewise, I think Pakistan should also, in its own interest, open its economy to the larger South Asian economy. Because Pakistani economy is not going anywhere unless it opens up to the South Asian economy, because South Asia means Afghanistan, India, and this vast region. And in this, the Pakistanis have certain natural advantages, Indians have certain natural advantages. But if Pakistan start thinking that opening up means that I'll be finished, that I'll be destroyed, then it's a bit of a problem. So, but they have, unfortunately, we have been waiting for more than a decade for Pakistan to give India most favored nation status. So despite commitments, it hasn't really come through, because you have a very powerful clique in Pakistan that does not allow that. But if you talk to Pakistani businessmen, they would love to open up and do business with India, because they know they can earn a lot of money out of it.
Hi, Seema Sirohi. I'm a columnist for the Economic Times. Manoj, I wanted to ask you about Doklam, what the present situation is, because there's some who say that the Chinese are back exactly where they were, and that the agreement, quote unquote, was just to allow the summit to take place. And my other questions about the Quad, not to push you too much on it, the point is, what other option does India have? I mean, it has to get in some sort of fencing mode with other countries. It's not in a position to send signals or do anything to China on its own as yet. So what we are doing is, okay, we don't have shared values, or it's containment by another name, or at least strategic fencing, one could argue.
Well, to start with your second question first, India, I don't have to tell you, India is a very huge country. It's got a very huge military. It's a nuclear weapons state. So it does not face any existential threat from China. Because in a nuclear, existential threats become mutual. So we are in this, just replace India with China when it was dealing with the erstwhile Soviet Union. So yes, of course, it reached out to the US, but it did not expect the US to defend it. Between 1980 and 2000, the US and China were pretty close. Or I'd say between 1980 and 1971 and 1990, US and China were very close. And they were oriented against the erstwhile Soviet Union. But they were not military allies. China did not expect the US to come to its military aid. They didn't need to. They had enough. So likewise, I don't think we need military alliance, with anyone. I think we can take care of ourselves in that in those circumstances. But yes, as I pointed out in my presentation, we have been lackadaisical in reforming our military system. We started off in 2002. We've not reached anywhere. Whereas China started off in 2013 or so, this particular phase, and they are now, by 2020, they would have completed it. And it's a pretty drastic reform. As far as Doklam is concerned, I can, if you can just show me that map again, and I'll explain to you. So first of all, I didn't show you this earlier. This is the position. Here is the Chinese. This is Chumbi Valley, and this is Doklam out here. So now the issue is that, first of all, this Chumbi Valley, many people say it's a dagger in the, pointed towards India, because we have this narrow neck here. This is Bangladesh. So this is just about 40 kilometers, even narrower out here, 40 kilometers. So this, and there's a rail, this connects to the northeastern part of India. So that's why India is very sensitive about this area, this Doklam area. But if you look at it another way, if you see Indian positions here in northern Sikkim, this across this, it's a plateau area, it's a flat area. We have got armor out here, which we put in 1986-87. We can cut off this area, and that's what we intend to do. Meaning, militarily, this area can be cut off. Actually, the Chinese are very vulnerable here. It's a very narrow area. If you can show me the other map, that this one. So if you see this, the Indians occupy the heights on the side, on the ridge. These are all the heights. This is the watershed. The border goes along the watershed. So the Chinese are in this narrow area. They are in fact vulnerable. Our problem is this ridge, because once you come to that ridge, then you are overlooking that whole Siliguri corridor, and that's what makes it sensitive for us. And that's the basis of contention. And now they say that this was the point where this road construction thing. So they are now back to where they were, and we are back up here. We are back 100 meters, meaning we just walked up. We're 100 meters up there. They've gone back. They have forces here, but this is part of China. You can't complain if they're there. But they're also aware that these forces there are actually vulnerable, because all this area is controlled by us. The big worry, of course, if you look at it from kind of military logic point of view, is that the Chinese could simply walk into Bhutan. And Bhutan doesn't have the state capacity to defend itself and outflank all of India. But that's those kind of scenarios can take you anywhere. But so if it's war, it's like World War I, World War II, walk into Belgium, walk into this thing, you bypass the defenses. So I don't, as I said, to think of those kind of things, you're talking of war, meaning with a capital W, meaning if you do these huge movements. And I can't see whether India or China, kind of contemplating something like that.
Right at the back corner.
My name is Roger Cochetti. I work with private equity in the technology sector, but my question really has to do with something you've mentioned in passing. You've talked about Japan and the United States and a number of other countries Well, but could you expand a little bit on what, if any, role Russia plays in this conflict? Because clearly they had been a close military cooperation with India in the past, and many people felt that the arrangement between the Soviet Union and India was intended to be pointed towards China, and many people felt the relationship between China and Pakistan was intended to be pointed towards India. And also, you've said almost nothing about Europe. I don't know, that may be for very good reason that there is nothing to say about Europe in the context of this conflict, but is there anything to say about Russia and Europe in this discussion? Thank you.
Well, in this Doklam, China, this kind of a thing, one of the most worrying things in the last, since the whole Ukraine crisis began, has been the fact that this has steadily pushed Russia towards China. And this is something which we constantly keep on telling the Americans, and we tell the Europeans, that we are between a rock and a hard place on this, because we had this favored defense technology relationship with Russia. What the Russians have given us, meaning the Americans aren't even thinking about, aren't even contemplating anything equivalent. Meaning the Russians have given us the technology to build a nuclear-propelled submarine. They have given us a supersonic cruise missile, which now forms a prominent part of our defense system. The Sukhoi aircraft, that principal fighter aircraft, is the Russian version, which is superior to what they've given to the Chinese. But now, slowly, and you know, the Russians know one thing, that one thing which we have not done is to cheat them on this. In the sense, we've done no reverse engineering. So we have not reverse engineered anything, and whereas the Chinese have. And this is something. But since the Ukraine crisis began, what has happened? It kind of coincides with the fact that oil prices also went down, and Russia was in a difficult situation, and so it's been steadily pushed towards China. And so now, when the Chinese are buying some of their cutting-edge equipment, etc. So Chinese also have the capacity to reverse engineer. They've made it into a fine art. They have the wherewithal, the laboratories, and the technology, groups which are able to take up a system and probably kind of take it apart and come up with something or the other, which we completely lack. So far, now the problem with India and Russia is that our relations are very anemic. Economic relations are extremely anemic. I think our trade is piffling, meaning $10 billion or something like that, which is meaning that the relationship doesn't really have substance. There is the congruence of views and ideas, etc. Meaning we see the Russians have been very helpful to us. For example, whenever the issue of Kashmir came up in the United Nations, we knew that the Russian veto would be there for us. See, but that world is changing, because the Russians are feeling the pressure, and what they say is, look, you guys are going with the United States. So if you guys are going to go with the United States, then you can't expect to keep us as close to you. See? And then, of course, as I said, that the relationship is anemic. It can't be only on the basis of a close of defense ties. Like, we've had ties with the United States. So even when there were no defense ties, we had reasonably good ties, because we have other areas of a good relationship, including the fact that we have a huge diaspora here, and amongst other things. So all that has helped. So that texture is not there in that relationship. Now, you can have futuristic plans. For example, the International North-South Transportation Corridor, which is supposed to link West Indian ports in the western coast of India to Bandar Abbas in Iran, and all the way up to the Baltic ports and to the Russian railway system. But you've got to have goods to export or import. So you can build that connectivity, but there are no goods export or import. So that relationship, as I said, is a problem. Now, the Russians know that from the existential point of view, their biggest worry is China. Because you have all of Eastern, Russia, which is where the population is very, very thin, and as compared to what China has on offer. So when you look at this whole pattern, and you mentioned Europe, so I've also spoken to Europeans about, but the Europeans are fixated on the European issue. In the sense, you have now, Sweden is thinking of reinstating conscription. Finland already has conscription. All of them are steadily raising their defense budgets. The Baltic states are very worried. They're sweating. They worry because of the pattern of behavior that we have seen coming out of from Russia. So they, from their point of view, they try to their aim is to curb Russian tendencies, the hybrid warfare and that kind of stuff. So they don't see our problem. Our problem is that the Russians grow closer to China. China gets access to certain technologies because for a long time, the Indian Air Force had an edge over the Chinese. And I would say even today, because the Chinese haven't yet got their 5th generation aircraft in service. But when you come to the Sukhois, we are ahead of them. They may have numbers, but the quality of our Air Force is superior. But that edge is going. Likewise, I think naval vessels, etc. Because of the equipment we carry on them, we still have the edge. But numbers are now the Chinese numbers are playing up. Chinese quality has been improving. Plus, they're having access to the Russian technology.
Thank you. My name is Zoe. I'm with Stimson. I was wondering, now that the standoff's been over for a while, do you see any qualitative shift in how Beijing perceives India, especially in terms of Indian resolve?
Post Doklam, how does Beijing look at India? Is there the way that India stood up? How does it see India?
Okay, well, that's a interesting question because as I told you, I was there in August in Beijing, and I was given all this hardline stuff about you guys, unless you guys do this, we'll do this, etc. And then suddenly, when the agreement took place, the tone has changed. So, and here and now, I'm being more of a journalist and hazarding a guess more than specific knowledge. My own view is that I think that in Beijing there is a certain amount of there's a dilemma about how to deal with India. See, and of course, I don't want to sound needlessly, kind of speculative on this, but as they say that the Chinese view of the world, you have this kind of hierarchical relations. So the Chinese have what they come to the U.S. and they say, but let's have the new type of great power relations. So they tell the U.S. We can do a condominium of sorts, in the sense that if you can divide the Pacific at an equitable point, you respect us, we'll respect you, etc. And so the question that we've been asking, and I asked this in Beijing 3 years ago when this thing first came up, was, does India figure in that great power typology? Are we also part of the? So I didn't get a clear answer on that. Now, the thing is that if you look at the smaller states, there Beijing is very clear that you guys, you should know your place. And I think that last year they issued this, I think, a document on Asia Pacific. My memory a bit hazy on that. They had a document on their policy in the Asia Pacific, and where they actually had a line saying that the smaller powers should stay out of the way. They should stay out of the way. Now the problem is that India is not a smaller power. So you have a certain view of where Pakistan ought to be. So okay, you want aid, we'll give it to you. Sri Lanka, etc. Now what do you do with India? Because even historically, India didn't come in the barbarian category. See, the West was in the barbarian category. Everyone else was subordinate, and there was really no place for India. Because there was also the thing is that India had also, Buddhism had come from India, many other influences had come from India, so they had also received things from India. So it was not as though it was Chinese munificence going outwards. So if you translate it into today's situation, they really have not been able to figure out how to deal with India. So one part out there says that, push these guys hard. We'll use Pakistan, we'll use Nepal, we'll push these guys hard. But I think another part of the system says, if you push them too hard, they're going to fall into the laps of the Americans. And then we are in trouble. Let's take it easy. So my feeling is there is this duality, there is this tension in their India policy, which is not quite resolved. So sometimes you have absolute, sweetness and honey when you're talking to the ambassador and yes, nice things and, how we can get along together, how we can shape the destinies of all what Deng Xiaoping told Rajiv Gandhi, all the kind of nice stuff. Other side you have something else where the Chinese worry about Tibet, about the succession, the Dalai Lama's succession, etc., where they are nervous about what will happen there.
What about moving away from land for a moment to the ocean and the Chinese building a port north of Karachi? Now, they talk about it in the context of the Middle East, but it also has implications for the Indian Ocean and also another neighbor, Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is so important to shipping. It may not be appropriate for India to try to get too much closer to Sri Lanka, but is there any other third party in that sort of Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, somebody who's, because the Chinese do have a big influence in Sri Lanka?
What is the Chinese role? How is China's role in Sri Lanka, and how does India see it, and what does India do? Sri Lanka.
Well, Sri Lanka again comes into their old typology because Zheng He, had come to Sri Lanka. He was involved in a war that happened in Sri Lanka. So the Chinese see Sri Lanka as a natural place where they have a point of view with regard to Sri Lanka. Incidentally, not many people know that Nepal was also a tributary of China, meaning they pay tribute to China. So when the Chinese look at this, they look at it in a very different way. So where Sri Lanka is concerned, in the Indian Ocean region, I think the Chinese are working along. On one hand, you see, when they look at what's called the so-called Malacca dilemma, that is that very substantive portion of Chinese imports, particularly oil, has to go through the Malaccas. And when they look at the map, who do they see sitting at the head of the Malaccas? It's India. And so so as I said, this thing is a duality. They worry about India. At the same time, they don't know what to do about India. So when it comes to Sri Lanka, I think what they started off when they built the port at Hambantota, which incidentally was offered to India before the Chinese took it up. I think they just kind of looked at it in a kind of a mechanical way that, you look at Hambantota and then you look at the world sea lanes, which are going right by Hambantota, very important area. But since Hambantota has opened, no one's going there. And now the airport that the Chinese have built, there's talk that the Indians may take it. Indian company might take it over. But I don't think the Chinese didn't realize that a lot of Sri Lanka's maritime prosperity comes from the fact that it's the transshipment point for Indian cargo. So all the heavy cargo comes in ships to Colombo, transshipped into, because the point is that Indians in our own way have not built a decent port where we can receive these heavy ships. So Colombo's prosperity depends on India. So periodically, of course, Chinese have these games. They're like they indirectly threaten Singapore because they have this big development in near Malacca. Malacca, I've forgotten now what project, Malacca Gateway or something project, where they say we'll build another Singapore, and that be the end of Singapore. That or the Isthmus Kra Canal, that's another, So there are all kinds of ideas, but all these ideas stem from a long-term plan that we want to be a long-term plan of primacy. And the thing about the Indian Ocean is that once the Chinese have established their primacy along the first island chain, which again is not it's not as though it's a kind of it will happen. They will move into the Indian Ocean. When they move into the Indian Ocean, they already have substantive presence. At least at any given time, 15 to 20 ships, Chinese ships, are there in the Indian Ocean. They built their first base in Djibouti. In Gwadar, they have which you can say it's probably a de facto, if not a de jure base in Gwadar. They're also looking for other places where they could establish themselves. It's basically what I said to you earlier, that their economy has expanded hugely, but their military power has not caught up, and they are now trying to make the military power catch up. So in another decade or so, you will see maybe a permanent presence of an aircraft carrier in the Indian Ocean region. Again, for us, fortunately, geography helps us, at least in the Indian Ocean, because we are a peninsula jutting out into the Indian Ocean. And as a peninsula jutting out into the Indian Ocean, we have certain advantages of being where we are. Though, of course, this is must be caveat is there that we must get our act together. We take 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years to build a ship. When the Chinese are churning them out on assembly line scale, we have to do better than we have been doing. We've got to up our game substantially.
Dr. Raj, get in. Up, come forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Aparna. Manoj, I'm sorry I missed your talk, but just a comment and a question. The Isthmus of Kra, the water levels are very different on both sides, so it's a huge engineering problem to build a canal across the Isthmus of Kra. Talking of the Chinese incursions, do you see a grand strategy, or are these random occasions that they are intruding on across the line of control here and there, periodically in varying strengths and for various durations of time? So I wonder if there's a grand strategy behind that. And was there a failure of Indian intelligence to have picked up on the movement of 15,000 troops into the Doklam region and 4 bulldozers is what I understand. And 150 tanks also, somebody has mentioned. So just comments on those. Thanks.
See, there are about, we have, as you know, that the border between India and China is marked out by a line of actual control, which is a virtual line, in the sense we have what we say there's a line of actual control which the Chinese know where it is, and the Chinese say the same, that there's a line of actual control where the Indians know where it is. But approximately there are about 14 places where the notion overlaps. In the sense, we say the line is at that end, they say the line is at this end, you see. And so there's this area here which we both patrol in about 14 places, not very, maybe 12, 13, 14 kilometers, someplace 40, maybe in the Depsang area, a little bit more. So there's this overlap. So eventually when but the thing is that as of now, there is agreement that we can patrol in this area, in this overlap area, but we can't put fixed structures and camps there. That's the broad agreement between us. So the 2013 crisis that took place in 2013 was because they came and pitched tents in the middle of that Depsang plains. And when they pitched tents there, which was changing the rules of the game, which then triggered off that particular crisis. Now, the thing is that whether these are random or they are not, you see, that that Depsang crisis took place about 30 days before Li Keqiang was going to come to Delhi. He was scheduled to come to Delhi. And in fact, curiously enough, all we had to do was to tell the Chinese that if you don't pull out from there, no visit for Li Keqiang. And that, of course, would have been a big loss of face because the Chinese premier's visit is called off. So the Chinese pulled up their tents and went off. Now, the second instance happened when Xi Jinping himself was in New Delhi. Xi Jinping himself was in New Delhi, and that this is a place called Chumur. Now, the strange thing is that in Chumur, the Indians have the dominating positions. In one of the few areas, Indians have the dominating positions, yet the Chinese were trying to build a road. I think, at some point, what happens is that what we often don't realize is Chinese foreign policy is not made by their foreign office. It's made by the PLA often, meaning particularly on the Sino-Indian border. If you look at the Border Defense Cooperation Agreement, it's signed by a PLA general. So the policy is often made by the PLA. Now, many people said rogue generals and all that. That's all nonsense. The PLA is very, very, in fact, the officers who were involved there were subsequently promoted, the Chinese officers. So I think there are signals there, though they're very difficult to discern what exactly is China trying to do. Is it China trying to push and say, let's settle, or this is going to continue? Or are they trying to keep the whole border permanently unsettled? Now, the interesting consequence I told you about the herders issue, the depopulation issue. What we are now witnessing in the Sino-Indian border is that, first of all, the Chinese had built their infrastructure in the Tibetan side, very good infrastructure, roads, etc. We are playing catch up. We are still trying to build our roads because our side is much tougher. Our terrain is much worse than the Chinese side. But now we're detecting signs that the Chinese are also building further infrastructure to populate those areas. So they're building multi-storied buildings, etc., where their military formations can live through the year. Otherwise, Chinese, to be very frank, don't go by these figures that say the Chinese have got 30 divisions in Tibet. They actually have 3 brigades, which is about, 15,000 men. As far as the PLA is concerned, PAP may be greater there. They have a big surge capacity because they have the infrastructure. They have a surge capacity to build up forces there. But now it seems that they are also planning to increase the number of forces that they put up on the Sino-Indian border because they are now confronting much stronger Indian forces. See, in the last decade, we have raised 2 new divisions entirely for the Sino-Indian border. Now we are raising another corps, that is 3 divisions plus for the Sino-Indian border. So the Indian defenses have been strengthened to the point where now the Chinese are a bit worried that because for them, Tibet is always a vulnerability. They're worried as to what the Indians could do. As they say that you look at when India says that we are developing a strike corps, what is a strike corps? A strike corps is a corps that will fight on your side of the border, meaning will go into Tibet. So when India has that capacity, the Chinese obviously, which they did not have till now, it clearly worries the Chinese, and so they are also now reacting on that front.
Dr. Kronstadt, you get the last final question.
Thank you, Alan Kronstadt, Congressional Research Service. And I wanted to follow up a little on Aparna's question about your very interesting piece on the Quad. While the World War II example is an illustrative one, it was an alliance of necessity. And it's worth remembering that the Soviets were treaty allies of the Germans up until mid-1941. But if Chinese troops were on the march, I think there's no problem India-U.S., Australia, say, signing on with Vietnam to fight, a military battle. But now the necessity isn't there, so national governments can be more circumspect, can take a little more time. I've always rejected the view, tended to reject the view that there's fixed interests for countries, that they actually can grow out of values. Having a conversation with Polly earlier, that values can determine interests to some extent. But let's set aside values and talk like in the cooperation between the four navies after the tsunami, the 2004 tsunami that afflicted India, Sri Lanka, the Indian Ocean. The governments found out that humanitarian assistance, disaster relief efforts went quite well, could have gone even better if there were better coordination and interoperability. So that was kind of the basis for that. And then a couple of years later, you did have four navies in 2007 conduct joint exercises, mainly on the HADR. But India and Australia both expressed wariness and nervousness about the reactions from China, and India did not want to have anything more than trilateral after that. So you started including, say, ASW, anti-submarine exercises in the Indian Ocean. Clearly, one could argue that it's in the interests of all four countries to have better interoperability when it comes to things like anti-submarine warfare. So in the 10 years since that first Quad exercise, we've seen, as you mentioned, some Djibouti military base for China. China's sending nuclear submarines into the Indian Ocean, Gwadar, Hambantota, et cetera. Set aside the values question, isn't it in the interests of India to have, to increase its interoperability on the naval scene, maritime security, with what are called like-minded countries? And these countries are like-minded based on perceived interests rather than anything to do with values. So how would you argue against a preference for quadrilateral naval exercises, given this argument?
I think, a lot of it rests on our history, in the sense the last 50, 60 years. The experience that we had, the kind of perspective we had, we went out through the Cold War as a kind of self-consciously non-aligned, etc. So we are coming from there. And the United States and its current partners are coming from another place. Okay, they went through the Korean War, they went through the Vietnam War, Seattle, the dissolution of Seattle, coming from there. The question is, as you rightly pointed, that we have seen that there are congruences. HADR was definitely one of them. The difficulties, often arise in a different way, in the sense that, when you use the word interoperability, that causes us a huge amount of nervousness. So in fact, in that recent that agreement on communication security. The COMCASA. So COMCASA has a changed version of what used to be the interoperability thing. So because the Indians were nervous about, so they have changed the terminology. I've forgotten exactly the whole agreement. So let me put the thing the other way around, in the sense, yes, because of Indian failure to maintain, to keep it, to get into the high growth path economically, and to reform its military, and to modernize its military, it is now in a situation where it needs external friends, okay, to balance China. It's a necessity. Likewise, for the United States, there is a certain necessity in balancing China, because no other country can fit the bill. Only a country of India's size and heft can provide a counterbalance. When you look at, and the problem is that the United States has so far, historically, dealt with allies for whom it's the net security provider. Whether it is Japan, whether it is Australia, whether it is United Kingdom, all these countries depend on the United States for its security, for their security. India is one country which it's not dependent and doesn't want to be dependent on the United States for its security. So what is India seeking? India is seeking more of a partnership. Now the question is of fixing the model. Because you see, it's one thing to have to be a junior partner, junior ally, which Japan and Australia are, to be very frank. They are junior allies. They're not, and India doesn't want to be in that position politically. But as I said, I also acknowledge the fact that India needs something from the United States. And of course, then beyond that is the question of trying to shape common interests. And I think we have a common interest. And this is why I gave the example of the Persian Gulf and Northern Arabian Sea area. We have a common interest in stability in the area. Just 2 years ago, we had to rescue citizens from Yemen. Even today, if you look at the situation, there are parts of it could blow up anytime. And we have citizens all over the place there. Yet we have zero conversation. So we can't have a kind of a schizophrenic relationship. Meaning if there are issues, if there are naval issues, we can't say, no, let's not go into that area. We keep an eye only on this area. So I think that we need this continuous conversation in this. And that's why I said that if you're doing HEDR, you can't restrict HEDR just to the PACOM area. Surely it could also take place in the CENTCOM area. So this division of CENTCOM, PACOM is something which I think is very negative. Because if we are talking of this new relationship between India and the United States, these are issues which we must address with some, with some degree of attention. Because we are talking of a new South Asia policy, if we are talking of the United States becoming more skeptical of Pakistan, because why the CENTCOM, why was India excluded from the CENTCOM? It has to do with Pakistan. The United States didn't want the two in the same setup. So it's a work in progress, but as I said, there are also fundamental issues. And as I said, one of those issues was the nature of the relationship. So the interoperability, etc., there's no doubt that they're very useful. Like interoperability in communications, like we have bought the United States the P-8I aircraft, but we are not able to get the best out of them in terms of dealing with the US. Now, it is, for example, we get information from the US on Chinese submarine movements. Okay, we are getting information from the US on Chinese submarine movements, but that information cannot have that same kind of vibrancy because it's not direct information. It has to be filtered through the various commands because our P-8Is are not going to being able to speak to the P-8As of that the US operates. So we've taken a step in a direction, but we have to work out the terms of engagement. And what India is saying is that our terms of engagement cannot be the same as the terms of engagement you've had with countries for whom you are the net security provider. Our terms of engagement have to be different. And I think the US also should not object because in the sense we are not asking the US to come and, boots on the ground or that kind of a scenario, whereas the Japanese and the Koreans, for them it's absolutely sine qua non of the whole situation, that unless the Americans promise boots on the ground, there's no value in the relationship.
On that note, we will end today's discussion. Thank you, Dr. Joshi. Thank you to everybody who came today and who's watching online. Thank you.